Hello everyone, this is Nate Nims from Grace Des Moines, and tonight we're going to have a little bit of a conversation about General Conference 2020. We had one of these a couple weeks ago on a Sunday morning, so some of this information, if you were there, you've heard before, but there's a couple updates if you are interested. For others that are wanting to learn what's going on in the Global United Methodist Church, this is your chance to hear about what's going on in our denomination. Now, there might be a couple noises that you hear in the background. Laundry is being done at this moment, and my cats are both being very odd. So just remember, in these moments, we're going for connection and not perfection. So let's just stay connected with one another. Hey, Brad, good to see you. Hope you all are doing well. Hey, Melody. So, General Conference 2020 was officially postponed. That news came out this morning. Some of you may have seen in the previous weeks that the bishops were asking to consider changing the date of the General Conference in light of everything that's going on. In addition to COVID-19, there have been issues with folks throughout African continents getting visas to be able to come to the United States. There's a lot of little issues going on, and then this pandemic took place. Where we were going to hold the General Conference in Minnesota said there's absolutely no way you can plan on meeting on your dates, and the bishops had already asked to change the date. So General Conference will happen. Unfortunately, we don't know when. It's just sort of up in the air right now. However, we do know what's going to be discussed, and we know some of the things that are going to come up. So that's what we're going to talk about this evening. There's a couple definitions and just some basic United Methodist insider language that we need to cover as we talk about this. So here's a few key terms that I'll probably be saying a few times. One of the biggest things that we're going to be discussing at General Conference is the status of LGBTQ persons in the United Methodist Church. LGBTQ stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer. It can be expanded to LGBTQIA+, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, asexual, and plus. I use the shorthand LGBTQ just as a placeholder to speak to all of the varieties of gender expression and sexual orientation that represents. So the biggest thing that will be discussed in 2020, hopefully in 2020, because it's been postponed and we don't know when the new date is, but at the General Conference, we will be discussing the status and the role of LGBTQ persons in the church. Can they be married in the church? Can they serve as clergy? Those are two of the issues that we are globally debating and discussing at this moment. Now, General Conference, if you haven't heard that term before or aren't familiar with the United Methodist Church, General Conference is the gathering that takes place every 4 years to set the doctrine and polity and policy of the United Methodist Church. It is the global gathering that represents United Methodism and speaks officially for our denomination. Now, at General Conference, there are up to 1,000 delegates that represent all of United Methodist Church. They come together from around the world, and in the recent history, the growing number of folks have come to General Conference from throughout the Philippines, the Ivory Coast, Uganda, and throughout the African nations. At General Conference, these delegates come together and their decisions get put into the Book of Discipline. The Book of Discipline is our laws, our regulation. It is our constitution as the United Methodist Church. It's what holds us together. The Book of Discipline is the official voice of our denomination. Now, the United Methodist Church is unique in that way because while we have bishops and while we have district superintendents and while we have pastors, no bishop, no district superintendent, and no pastor is ever the official voice of the United Methodist Church. Our official statements come from the Book of Discipline, and they also come from what we call the Book of Resolutions. We have a number of social principles in the United Methodist Church. In the Book of Discipline, they make up paragraphs 160 to 166, and they are expanded upon later in the Book of Resolutions. So if you want to know what the Methodist Church officially says about everyone's right to health care, how it should not be a privilege, but how we should have a healthcare system that cares for folks. If you want to know what the United Methodist Church is about environmental stewardship, encouragements for congregations to be sensitive to their uses of plastic, to not have styrofoam in their congregations. If you want to know what we believe about equal pay, all of those and more are found in the Book of Resolutions, these official statements of the United Methodist Church that encourage us to live out what we call social holiness, the faith that makes a difference in the world. Now, with all of this, with General Conference, with the Book of Discipline, with the Book of Resolutions, the United Methodist Church has come to be known as a connectional system. We are a connectional church because we implicitly and we explicitly connect with one another. We do that explicitly through this work with the General Conference, with the Book of Resolutions, with the Book of Discipline. We agree to abide by these rules and policies with one another. We agree to have a church where every congregation has a staff parish relations committee. That's the name of the church HR committee. We agree that every United Methodist Church will have a finance committee, and in the Book of Discipline, it dictates that that finance committee shall meet once every quarter to make sure that the books are not being cooked in any way and that things are staying at the status quo. It regulates that we have an annual audit. It regulates all of these policies and procedures that act as checks and balances to make sure our congregations, our members, and our clergy can be as healthy and faithful as possible. We're also a connectional church through what is called apportionments. They are connectional giving. It's a portion of the budget of every congregation that goes to support other congregations around the world. One of the biggest ways that our connectional giving is seen is through the work of UMCOR. UMCOR is the United Methodist Committee on Relief, and through their work, the United Methodist Church is making a difference around the world. One of the biggest examples in my life of the importance and the role that UMCOR has played is I think back to when the earthquakes took place in Haiti. UMCOR was already there on the ground. They were already making a difference in that area, and then they were there with the people throughout all of that work. And as funds came in to help the people of Haiti recover from those earthquakes, all of the monies to that cause went to that cause, because as United Methodist, we have come together and said, our churches will cover the cost of the business side. We'll cover the salaries. We'll cover the cost of paper. We'll cover all those sort of odds and ends costs so that all of the work and all the mission and all the ministry can be done with the funds that are collected for all of these different things. We're a connectional church that way. We're held together. We unite. That's why we're called United Methodists. However, we're not as united as our name suggests, unfortunately. And this current situation that we find ourselves in is nothing new. It has been a debate and a discussion in our denomination since 1972. So the United Methodist Church was formed in 1968. It brought together the Evangelical United Brethren, and it brought together the Methodist Episcopal Church. These two denominations had a lot in common theologically and socially. It was a good fit for us to come together, and it was an era of mergers in society, and so it just seemed to click. And in 1968, the United Methodist Church was formed. In 1968, in the Book of Discipline, as approved by General Conference, there was a statement about sexuality. That statement about sexuality was 4 or 5 sentences long. It did not say very much. It was very concise. It said, we believe that sexuality is best expressed in a covenant. We believe that sexuality should not be abusive or demeaning in any way, and we abhor any form of abuse related to sexuality. In 1968, that was the official stance of the United Methodist Church when it came to marriage and sexuality. Since then, the official stance of the United Methodist Church has grown a lot. It has expanded, and now it is about a page and a half in the discipline because we've been fighting over this language. And the language that we have been fighting over the most is what we call the incompatibility clause. So in 1972, language was introduced and approved at the General Conference that added these words to the Book of Discipline. We believe that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. That has been in the discipline since 1972. Homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. The discipline has been nuanced, and the Book of Resolutions have been nuanced in different ways to say, while this incompatibility language is still there, the United Methodist Church encourages families not to condemn LGBTQ children, right? There are these little moments in the discipline where you see both sides and everyone in between highlighting and saying, we don't agree when it comes to this. Since 1972, language has tried to be introduced to the discipline. So every 4 years since then, in 76 and 80 and 84 and 88 and 92 and 96 and 2000, in all of these years, there has been a lot of debate and discussion about that incompatibility clause and what that means for our denomination. Because there's only two things that the United Methodist Church believes officially is incompatible. We, as a denomination, officially believe that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching, and we believe that war is incompatible with Christian teaching. That is what our discipline has said since 1972. Now, because this has been going on for 50-some years, we know and we should be able to admit that we're a divided church. We're not of one mind when it comes to this. And as a connectional church, as a global church, when we think about what happened with the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America or the Presbyterian Church of the Presbyterian United Methodist, that's not what I meant. The Presbyterian Church of the United States of America. Those two denominations, when they took their step to be more inclusive and welcoming, or at least provide a way for their congregations to decide if they would be more inclusive and welcoming, it really divided and divested their denomination. There were a lot of lawsuits, there were a lot of fights. It was very expensive and ugly to go through that process. And because of that, United Methodists in general have argued that we should not divide, we should not separate, we should try to find a way forward together. At the same time, though, there have been agencies and groups and individuals that have said for a number of decades now, we don't agree, we should go our separate ways. One of those groups that has bubbled up is Good News, also known as the Institute for Religion and Democracy, also known as the Wesleyan Covenant Association. In different ways here and there, they have argued for some form of separation in one way or another, and there's been other forms of separation that have bubbled up as well. But for a long time, this has been a discussion in our denomination. Should we stay together or should we go our separate ways? So I just want to give a broader history lesson of Methodism, because rumors and separations and schisms, frankly, it's nothing new to us. We have been through this before many, many times. If you didn't know, the Salvation Army was once a part of the United Methodist Church, or the Methodist Episcopal Church, as we were previously known. So the Methodist Episcopal Church was founded and formed in 1784 at the Christmas Conference. Now, when the Christmas Conference took place, the Methodist Church was brand new to the United States. John Wesley in England started the Methodist movement, and at that time and in that place, they were Episcopal. It was the Church of England, right? John Wesley was a pastor, a clergy person in the Church of England, and the Methodist movement started as a system of small groups. It was a way for people to come together. So there were Methodists that were Protestant, there were Methodists that were Catholic, there were Methodists that were Presbyterian. All sorts of Methodists came together from different denominations, and it wasn't its own denomination. When the colonies got over and got started, John Wesley finally caved in and said, you probably should be your own church. The Revolutionary War was going to happen. We were going to be split one way or another. So at the Christmas conference in the late 1700s, the Methodist Episcopal Church was founded. But when it was founded, we were already segregating ourselves from one another. There were black clergy persons that were cut off from our denomination. If they were slaves or if they were free, they were second-class citizens in our denomination. And so they were forced to sit in the back of the balcony at the founding of our denomination. At the Christmas conference, they were forced out. And so from there, the African Methodist Episcopal Church and the African Methodist Episcopal Church Zion were formed. Those were two of the first schisms in our denomination. That was followed by the Methodist Protestant Church that broke off in the 1860s. In the 1860s, the Free Methodist Church split off. In the 1830s, it was the Methodist Protestant Church. And in 1844, the Methodist Episcopal Church split over slavery. Now, eventually, the Methodist Episcopal Church, the Methodist Protestant Church, and North and South, those denominations came back together in 1939 to found the Methodist Episcopal Church again. So we had separated, we had gone our separate ways over slavery, over a number of other issues, and then we came back together in 1939 to found the Methodist Episcopal Church. But when that denomination was founded, we created what's called the central jurisdiction. So Methodism is divided up into regions. So in Iowa, where Grace is, we are a part of the Iowa Annual Conference. We are connected in a very special way to every other United Methodist congregation in this state. But then on top of that, we're also connected to the jurisdiction that we are a part of. So our jurisdiction is Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Michigan, Indiana, West Ohio, East Ohio, Northern Illinois, and Illinois Great Rivers. These different annual conferences, as they're called, come together and make up our North Central jurisdiction. In the Methodist Episcopal Church and what became the United Methodist Church, we've had these jurisdictions based on region. But in 1939, when the Methodist Episcopal Church was founded, we had these regional bodies, but then we had the central jurisdiction for black congregations. They were separate and they were not equal. They were separated and they were cut off from the rest of the Methodist Episcopal Church. And that remained the case until 1968. At one time or another, throughout all of our history, unfortunately, in the Methodist movement, there has always been active discrimination. This is nothing new to us. Think about not just what we've done with African American and black persons in the United States with the Methodist Church. There is also the status and role of women in the church. So women were first ordained in the Methodist Protestant Church in 1880. Yay! Right? You may or may not have heard Irene cheer for that in the background. But in 1880, women were ordained. But then in 1939, when the Methodist Protestant Church merged back with the Methodist Episcopal Church North and the Methodist Episcopal Church South, women lost their ordination right. That was the way that those churches were able to come back together. They said, no longer. Women were not ordained again in the Methodist movement until 1956. Right? Oppression, one way or another, has always been a part of our denominational history. We have not been able to get past saying some folks are good, some folks aren't good enough. It is very unfortunate that we have to admit that about our history. Now, while we do have to admit to that, while we have to own to our history so we can make up for it in our future, just thinking, I know there was a lot to cover just then, because We're at a time of potential schism and split. Frankly, one way or another, there will be a split in the Methodist Church. And we should know that this has happened before. This is nothing new for us. But at the same time, while we can admit and think of all of this pain in our past, what are things that we can celebrate? What are things in our history that we can cherish and love and be proud of? So you can, in the comments, I'd encourage you to start thinking for yourself. What about the United Methodist Church and our history and our values and our traditions? What about being a Methodist is important to you? What would you say? For myself, as you think about it, as you start to type whatever you want in the comments, the things that are important to me are things like prevenient grace. That is key to my connection with this church. If we did not have this language and this hope of prevenient grace, that God is with and for all people, luring us towards perfection in love, I don't know if I would be a United Methodist. That is really foundational to my understanding of what it means to follow Christ, that we live into this grace that is with and for all people. I also love our connectional system, that as flawed as it is important for us to help one another, to be there for each other, to encourage one another, to lift each other up, to hold each other accountable. I'm sure you can think of any number of stories in the news in any number of denominations, and unfortunately in our own, where we didn't necessarily hold someone accountable. And that's because our systems were in place, but they failed, right? Like we've tried to do well. We haven't always made the mark, but we have all of these checks and balances in place to make sure that we are healthy and accountable and faithful, right? So those are a couple of the things that I really appreciate about the United Methodist Church. But it's not just the United Methodist Church as a global movement that we're talking about. We're talking about our congregation. We're talking about Grace, right? Like that is our church as a part of this movement. And at Grace, while the global church isn't there, we've made the move. As the sign in front of our church says, without condition, without exception, God loves all. Yeah, the social consciousness. I agree, Kristen. I can't read your whole comment, but yeah, the emphasis on Christian life, the discernment, the way that we hold our heart and our head together, those are all very important virtues and values in our denomination. So what about grace are the things that you want to hold to, the things in our Methodist tradition and connection that make Grace special? I am new to Grace, and some folks watching this might be even newer to Grace than I am. But one thing that I love is that our church does express our social holiness. Grace does strive to reach out, to lift up, to lend a hand, and to be there with folks in times of need. And we're even trying to do that now as we figure out what all this looks like. You know, there are all sorts of ways that we live out this history and this connection with one another. So there's some big overview stuff. And if you want to keep commenting about what you like about Grace or what you like about the United Methodist Church and our theology and doctrine, feel free to do that. But I want to get to some specific history about how we got to the place that we find ourselves in now and why talk of split is at the forefront of the global Methodist mind at the moment. So, as I said before, debate and discussion around the language in the discipline related to sexuality has been very disruptive over the years. It has been very contentious. It has been a wedge issue in a multitude of ways. And so, since 1972, there have been a number of times where language such as, we are not of one mind when it comes to human sexuality. There have been ways that we've tried to say we agree to disagree. There have been all sorts of nuanced language that has tried to be introduced to the discipline to say the United Methodist Church as a global church does not agree about this. But we have never been able to vote in a way that says we agree to disagree. And unfortunately, some of those votes were close to like 49 to 51%. Right? Like we had nearly 50-50 votes that said we don't agree that we don't agree. We have been struggling and fighting over this for a long time, and it really came to a head at the General Conference in 2016. So the General Conference, the way it works is delegates from around the world come together, and one of the first things that they do is they vote on the rules of order. So in our policies, in our meetings as that global body, we follow Robert's Rules of Order for the most part. And then we introduce language about who can speak on the floor, can guests be invited to share expert information, what do we expect from one another when it comes to the time limit for speeches, all that sort of stuff. So the rules are one of the first things that gets debated and discussed at General Conference. And at General Conference in 2016, debating the rules should have taken about half an hour, maybe an hour at the most. It's usually not a big part of what we do. But at that General Conference, the debate and the discussion around the rules took almost 4 days. It was a very ominous sign. It did not look good for us. One day at General Conference, before our meetings and discussions went on, one of our musicians was playing a prelude for the day. And the song that they played was A Song of Ice and Fire. And if you don't know what A Song of Ice and Fire is, it's the theme song to Game of Thrones. It was very ominous to just say we are arguing, we are fighting, we are at war with one another. And we were not off to a very good start. Because our debate and discussion had been so delayed in 2016, there was a time where a number of folks stood up to ask that the discussion around sexuality be tabled. So it wouldn't be discussed at the 2016 General Conference. It would be moved to a special session that was going to take place sometime between 2016 and 2019. And it took place in February of 2019. Because we were so arguing and so wedged against one another, the bishops were asked to form a commission on a way forward. So a number of folks got together to try to figure out how our denomination could move on, how we could take a step forward together. And the goal of the Commission on the Way Forward was to keep us all United Methodists, to find a way that this movement could move forward together. So of all the options that were discussed, there were numerous options, but the Commission on the Way Forward decided to say we are endorsing what was known as the One Church Plan. Now, the One Church Plan allowed for congregations, annual conferences, and pastors to decide if they would be open to having LGBTQ clergy or weddings. So that One Church Plan would have said to clergy, you can decide if you will host a wedding. Then it would have said to congregations, you can decide if you will accept a pastor that is out and if you will accept having a wedding in your sanctuary. It would have given choice to every church. That meant some congregations could have chosen to be more open and inclusive. They could have made that step like Grace has, even though it's not officially accepted in the United Methodist Church. But Grace has moved forward and said, our welcome statement is open to all and all are welcome here. So it could have given congregations the ability to do that. But it also would have given congregations the blessing from the United Methodist Church to say, no, you are not welcome, you are not included, you cannot be you. So there was a lot of debate and discussion around that. Do we want to say some congregations can go forward with our blessing, if at the same time we're going to say to other denominations, you can discriminate with our blessing? There was another plan on the table called the Simple Plan that got a little bit support but not enough to go very far. The simple plan would have removed all of the language in the discipline around sexuality, so it would have been by discipline, and then according to the official voice of the United Methodist Church, a non-issue. So at the special session in 2019, they gathered to discuss, for the most part, the One Church plan. But there was another plan that was introduced. It started out as the traditional plan, and then it was amended and changed, and so it became the modified traditional plan. That was the plan that eventually won the vote. It was not a large margin by which the vote took place, but the modified traditional plan had more votes. In the modified traditional plan, for the first time in Methodist Church history, the discipline mandated a punishment for clergy that perform weddings for same-gender couples. So the modified traditional plan says that if a pastor performs a wedding for a same-gender couple, they will be on unpaid leave for 1 year. If after that period of unpaid leave, they perform another ceremony, they would be defrocked. Defrocked means they would lose their status as a clergy person and would no longer be able to be a pastor in the United Methodist Church. Not only did that increase the penalty, it mandated a penalty. And that is a huge thing in our denomination because we don't have a mandated penalty for sexual assaults. We don't have a mandated penalty for embezzlement. There is a current United Methodist news story going around from our jurisdiction, from Ohio, where a clergyman has sexually assaulted and harassed multiple women, over 20, and yet he was not defrocked. He, at the moment, it is likely, if all goes well, at least I hope it's likely, to be reconsidered, but he has his clergy credentials and status, while the modified traditional plan said if you were to do a wedding for a same-gender couple, you would be out of a job automatically. That was a step too far for a lot of people. It was a step too far even for folks that didn't want to allow their churches to have same-gender weddings or to welcome same-gender couples, because something about that just seems so opposed to our fundamental understanding of grace. The modified traditional plan was punitive, and it was aggressive, and it was angry, it was punishing, and it was not who we are. So from there, from February of 2019, there has been a lot of debate and discussion around that, with some churches saying we will not abide by the modified traditional plan, with some bishops saying we will not enforce the modified traditional plan, with some jurisdictions, some whole collections of bishops and annual conferences saying this is not who we are and we will not go that way. So that's what's led us to this moment, getting ready for General Conference 2020. Now there are numerous plans in place, but the plan that is getting the most publicity and the most press is what's called the Protocol for Reconciliation and Grace Through Separation. That plan was first made public on January 3rd. Now, a select group of appointed individuals met with a mediator. This small group represented some, but not nearly all of the diversity of the United Methodist Church. And they gathered to debate a way of dividing our church, but then moving forward together. If this plan passes, it would provide a way for the remaining United Methodist Church to move forward with more inclusion and welcome to LGBTQ persons. At the same time, it would provide $25 million to those that want to create a more conservative or traditional Methodist movement, and then it would provide $2 million to those that want to create a more liberationist or progressive United Methodist movement. Now, the protocol has received a lot of press since January, and some of that press was misleading. It made it seem like The vote had already happened. The movement was already done. Things were already going forward. But General Conference has not met yet. General Conference has now been postponed, and we don't know officially when General Conference will meet this year, if it does end up this year. And I am really hopeful that it ends up this year, because we can't keep waiting. Now, there were multiple plans that were submitted to General Conference. Any United Methodist or any person really can fill out the form online and submit legislation to the General Conference to be considered. And I don't have it with me because it is at the church, but so some of you know I am a delegate to General Conference. I am one of the folks that will be there debating and discussing all of this. And I didn't bring my legislation with me, but it's thicker than this Bible, all of the legislation that we have to read. So there's a lot that is being debated and discussed. And there were a lot of plans that came forward, and I don't have the link with me. I think Irene might drop it in, or someone else might drop it in. But okay, there is a comparison chart. Irene is in favor of the new plan, but after this is wrapped up, if someone else doesn't beat me to it, I'll put in the comparison chart for proposals to General Conference. Now, some of these proposals, some of the folks that put them forward were a part of the group that came together to do the protocol for grace and reconciliation and grace through separation. Now, because of that, they, as people that came together to put that protocol in place, they have said, our plans will be on the back burner. So they've said, we will not publicly support or endorse those anymore. We'll just move forward with the protocol. So representatives of what was called the Indianapolis Plan and the UMC Next Plan were a part of the protocol. Now, because Irene posted the link to the new plan, I'll talk about that before I talk about the protocol. Now, the new plan would create multiple denominations. It stands, new in that plan stands for New Expressions Worldwide, and it would create 4 new Methodist movements. There would be a traditional, a moderate, a progressive, and a liberationist. Think of it as far right, center left, far left. Those would be the denominations that would be born out of the United Methodist Church. And because those denominations were born out of the United Methodist Church, there would be no United Methodist Church remaining. The new plan would allow for a transitional council that would put together. So there would be a group of representatives with a couple people from each of those new denominations that would come together and look at ways that we could dissolve church assets and provide funds to each of these new denominations so that they would have their best step forward in getting started. Local churches under the new plan would vote by a 2/3 majority to decide which one of those denominations they would be a part of, and then pastors would decide which part they would be a part of as well. In the new plan, general church assets would be divided equally, and they would come together and start to have our boards and agencies become their own nonprofits. So because we would not have a United Methodist Church anymore, under the new plan, organizations like UMCOR would become their own body, their own entity, their own nonprofit. These new denominations would create their own policies, they would be separate from one another, and they would start finding their way forward as they walked their separate paths in 2020, with the goal of coming together in 2024 to finalize everything that the Transitional Council would approve. So that roughly is the new plan. There would be 4 new denominations. There would be 4 new Methodist movements: far right, center left, far left, and they would come together in different ways to decide how to divide church assets, but then they would ultimately separate to find their own ways forward. This plan would allow for, frankly, a level of honesty and decision making in every local church that we just haven't had yet. There are a number of local churches that don't believe this is an issue, don't think it's an issue, don't think it's anything to talk about or deal with, and they just don't deal with or admit that it's going on. The next plan would force decisions to be made and would force congregations to see where they land and where they're going to go forward with that. Now, I won't talk about the next generation UMC or the Indianapolis plan, because persons that formed those plans have decided to endorse the protocol with reconciliation and grace through separation. Now, this plan, like the new Expressions Worldwide, would create new denominations, but it would not create as many new denominations, and the United Methodist Church would remain intact. There would be, if the protocol passes, there will be at least 2 Methodist denominations, and likely 3, but honestly likely more than that as well. The United Methodist Church would remain, but it would provide a path out for congregations to start their own way, or their own denominations if they saw fit. So by a vote globally, outside of the United States, there are central conferences, and those central conferences would have to vote by a 2/3 majority to decide if they were going to stay within the global United Methodist Church, form a new Methodist denomination, or do their own thing. Annual conferences in the United States would have to vote by a 57% majority to decide if they were going to stay within the United Methodist Church or move to another denomination or even start their own. And then local churches under the protocol could choose to either vote by a 66% majority or a simple majority to decide where they were going to land. And then clergy would choose. Now, in the protocol, new Methodist denominations would have to have at least 100 congregations to be viable as a new denomination. So they would have to identify with 100 churches to come forward. And that is why, likely, if the protocol passes, there would be more than 2 or 3 or 4 new denominations. There was news out of Florida a couple weeks ago of a way to start a Florida Methodist church separate from the WCA and the IRD and the Good News and those agencies that have worked towards this separation on the more conservative side. So there will likely be multiple separations if the minimum is 100 congregations to form a new denomination. Now, if the protocol was passed, there would be a moratorium on all complaints related to LGBTQ prohibitions in the United Methodist Church. Now, the language that they use is moratorium, and that language is important because the protocol does not guarantee that the incompatibility language gets removed from the discipline. The protocol says that we will act as if it is not there. It says that we will no longer punish out clergy, that we will no longer punish pastors that do ceremonies, we will no longer be punitive officially towards LGBTQ persons or congregations that are inclusive or welcoming. But the protocol does not say the language will be deleted. That is there partly because of the mediation that took place to put the protocol together. They needed a broad base of support. They had to guarantee a lot of folks coming to the table agreeing to this, and so moratorium was the best that select group decided they could do. That is one of my biggest struggles with the protocol, to be honest. It sets us up to take that next step, but it doesn't guarantee that that step will be taken, and that is where I struggle a little bit. It says we'll do this eventually. It doesn't say that we're going to take care of it right now. Now, churches would decide where to go, and congregations would decide where to go. Pastors would decide where to go as well. The $25 million in the protocol that would be paid towards those that are more conservative or traditional and would not want to create a more inclusive and welcoming United Methodist Church, they would be given $25 million over the course of 4 years. Then $2 million would be set aside for those on the more left or the more progressive or more liberationist. While that money is being given away, $39 million over the course of 8 years would be given to support various ethnic ministries as well as Africa University. Now that is a lot of money. However, it would likely be less money than what would be litigated, and that's the push and pull of the protocol. We've got a lot of money that we're talking about, but we're also talking about a global church that has a lot of assets tied up in different ways, and lawsuits, especially global lawsuits, are very messy and very expensive. So there's also pensions to deal with. There are Westpath is the agency that oversees pensions for pastors. So there's a lot that is going on. Now, in the protocol for separation, there's a way that the denominations that split would still have some ecumenical agreements. We would not, necessarily shake the dust and leave one another behind. We would find ways to stay in touch. And with the United Methodist Church and various other Methodist movements, we do have some similar agreements. There's the World Methodist Council. There are groups that get together in ecumenical settings to set in with one another. And the protocol provides a way to say something like every United Methodist, or at least most United Methodists, the vast majority of us, support an agency like UMCOR. So what can we do when we split to make sure that UMCOR keeps doing the important work that it's doing? So there are some details around that. Now, the plan was, if the protocol passed, that it would go into effect at the end of General Conference. Before General Conference was postponed, the end of General Conference was going to be May 15th. So that would have been when the moratorium officially took place related to all the language of sexuality in the discipline. Then, if General Conference would have happened when we thought it would, on January 1st of next year, the new denominations and the remaining United Methodist Church would begin to function and move forward. Then in July of next year, would be a deadline for annual conferences to decide where they're going to go. By the end of 2021, the central conferences, all the Methodist Church affiliated bodies around the world would decide where they were going to go, and local churches would have until 2024 to decide which way they were going to go. So that's a lot to sort of take in and consider. There's a lot of discussion around the protocol. There are all sorts of debates and discussions going on. I was asked a while back to write an article for Ministry Matters, which is an online magazine in the United Methodist Church, about where I was falling with all of these plans and provisions. And at the time when I wrote that article, I compared where we are as a church to an episode of Columbo. Now, some of you are probably much more familiar with Columbo than I am, because I only saw it as like reruns on late night TV. But if you've ever seen an episode of Columbo, you know that it starts with the crime taking place. Right? Columbo is very interesting because it begins with who killed the butler in the pantry with a candlestick, right? Like we know where things are heading and where things are going from the very start of an episode of Columbo. But what made the show fascinating was seeing how does this bumbling and seemingly inept detective figure everything out, right? Like that was the joy of the show. In this moment in the United Methodist Church, at least globally, we know where things are heading, and we know one way or another, schism and split is going to happen. At Grace, we have felt some of the effects of this because this split and this schism has a name and a face, or multiple names and multiple faces that we know and we love. We have seen people come to our church that have left because things haven't progressed fast enough. We have had members and clergy persons and people that we love that have been punished and harmed by this system because this system still says they are incompatible with Christian teaching. And we know that maintaining this status quo is not healthy or helpful or just or represents anything that has to do with the kingdom of God, right? Like we know something has to change. Unfortunately, we just don't know yet how we're going to get from here to there. The new plan offers one path, the protocol offers another, and both will be up for discussion at General Conference whenever that takes place. Now again, General Conference has been postponed, and the new dates we hope will be out sometime soon, but they also haven't said what sometime soon means. So we'll find out eventually when the General Conference will gather, but eventually we will. Now, a positive note, a small positive note as we move forward is there seems to be an agreement, even though the protocol hasn't passed yet, that bishops and annual conferences will abide as if that moratorium is already in place. That we will move forward and not punish one another or not punish pastors or clergy persons or congregations that want to be more inclusive and welcoming. That is important to a church like Grace and a people like us because I want to read to you now our welcoming statement. The welcoming statement that Grace has is this: God's love is for all, and God's grace is present in all creation. God's Spirit draws us into community. We are filled with genuine care and love for one another. Honoring the diversity of our faith journeys, we welcome and extend to all people of all races, sexes, ethnic backgrounds, generations, physical and mental abilities, economic conditions, sexual orientations, gender identities, and gender expressions. No matter who you are, no matter where you are in your life, you are welcome here. We are all invited to bless the church with our love, our presence, and our participation. That is who we have said we are. And Kristen, to your question about having General Conference without an in-person vote, that has been discussed, but unfortunately, because the General Conference is the official vote and voice of the United Methodist Church, there's no provision in the discipline yet to say that we can do that. And that has created a real interesting bind because our policy doesn't say that we can, and we can't change the policy until we meet in person to change the policy. So we're in a pretty tricky situation right now with that. There are hopes that that sort of language could be introduced, but the General Conference would have to vote on that before we could move forward without in-person attendance. And there would be some important details and security that would have to be in place because at the special session of the General Conference, there were a few voting irregularities. We use keypads to vote that are assigned to delegates, and some delegates that either were not there or were not there for certain votes still had their keypads used for certain votes. So there's been some mistrust and some lack of voting ethic in the United Methodist Church, unfortunately, for a while. But we might be able to have a vote without being in person at some point. But unfortunately, we'd have to change the language of the discipline to do so, and we can't change that language until we meet in person. The Methodist Church is called Methodist because we were methodical. We were never called the efficient church, and that's very clear in all of this. But our welcoming statement has said we're already moving forward. We're in this together, and we're going to keep in this together. So we'll move forward. We just don't know what pace we're going to be moving forward. But at Grace, we have our welcoming statement. We know where we stand, and we know who we're going to support. That our LGBTQ kin will always be welcome in our church. That we've said as a congregation that weddings are equal and that clergy are supported in choosing if they want to host weddings, which I do and will. So that's kind of where we are right now. In the comments as we wrap up, we're thinking about where the United Methodist Church is going in the future, which is also where Grace is going in the future. So setting aside everything that we've just talked about, as important as it is, we as a congregation have to know where we're going and where we're headed. So this, hopefully, will be settled in this year, and then in 2021, we will enter a brave new future with one another. I really do assume that the General Conference will meet sometime this year. The Iowa Annual Conference will meet this year as well. We passed a motion last year that was symbolic, but had a lot of language of saying we will not uphold the modified traditional plan, and we encourage clergy and congregations to support one another and welcome their LGBTQIA kin. So steps are being taken, but in 2020 and beyond, when you think of our welcome statement and who Grace is going to be, what kind of images or what kind of ideas, what kind of pictures come to mind for you? For myself, it has been great to see, at least when we've been in person, to see new people, to know that every Sunday is someone's first Sunday. And someone a couple weeks ago, one of the last Sundays that we met together in person, they came up to me and they said, I won't tell you what other churches I've been to in town, but you need to know how welcome and how loved I felt here. And it was just, I told them I need to give you a hug, because that was just good to hear from somebody else, that this support and welcome, our talk of uncommon hospitality isn't just talk. They felt cared for, they felt loved, and they said this has not been my experience in other congregations, even unfortunately in other United Methodist congregations. My vision and my hope for Grace is that we find more and more ways to live out that welcome, to embody that uncommon hospitality, to be allies and advocates that stand up for one another. If all goes well, we'll see what happens with our timeline now. A lot of things are in flux, but if all goes well, on May 17th, we are planning on having the executive director of One Iowa join us at Grace. Courtney Reyes is her name, and she's their executive director, and I invited her to talk with us at Grace so we could know more about how we could get involved with LGBTQ equality and justice issues in Iowa, because marriage equality was not the end of that struggle. There's all sorts of ways that we can empower and support one another and witness to the justice and the joy that God wants for us and our LGBTQ siblings. That's what I hope for our church. That's what I hope for our denomination, and we are inching towards it, but it has been a long crawl since 1972, and now it's finally at a head. So that's what I wanted to share with you. you can keep this conversation going in the comments. Thank you for all the ways that you've chimed in and all the little likes and thumbs up and hearts. And the fun thing about doing these videos on Facebook Live is, you know, y'all are not a congregation to say amen or hallelujah during a sermon, and I'm fine with that because it would frankly like throw me off if people responded out loud that much. But it's nice to just have those little pop-ups and think like, oh, that's what that's like. I'm having fun with these. I hope you are too. So we can keep discussing this in the comments. If you have any questions, any thoughts, anything that you want to learn more about, let me know in the comments. Send me an email and I will be in touch. So thank you for hanging out with us during the conversation, and we'll be in touch again soon. Thanks for caring about the future of our church, and thank you for being the people of grace. Because you're the uncommon hospitality that makes all the difference. So thank you very much, and we'll talk to you again later. Bye.